Ben Packard and I, as I said, are co-organizing this series, which will be meeting regularly on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. through May 10th. So 6 additional sessions after today, some of them in person, some simply on Zoom. You'll be able to find information about all of these on our website if you want to check there, and the link for it from week to week as well. I want to begin with the UW Tribal Land Acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. This reminder of our historical past seems to me especially apt today as we discuss the shared goal of a sustainable and equitable future. My guiding principle for academic introductions has always been the more distinguished the speaker, the shorter the introduction. Today's introduction will be very short. Our guest is Asim Prakash, the Walker Family Professor of Political Science at UW and the founder and director of the UW Center for Environmental Politics. He's the founding editor of the Cambridge University Press series on business and public policy, as well as the Cambridge Elements in Organizational Response to Climate Change. His research focuses on climate governance, NGOs, and voluntary regulation. Among his many awards, the American Political Science Association's 2020 Eleanor Ostrom Career Achievement Award, in recognition of, quoting from them, his lifetime contribution to the study of science, technology, and environmental politics. Professor Prakash has published extensively and influentially in academic journals, and more unusually, has gained a prominent voice in public venues such as Forbes and the Washington Post. We are incredibly fortunate to have him at our university, and even more fortunate to have him here almost in person today. So, round of applause for him.
Thank you. So let's see. Yep, excellent. Thank you. I think,
Can you share?
yeah, I'm trying.
Before.
Let's see. It's not showing. I'll try again.
We always test these things in advance, and then this happens anyway. See?
That's not a problem. It's just give me a second. Let's try again.
All of you here in person, just keep really prepping your really hard questions, okay?
Is it working now?
Yes.
Yes, you just need to go into speaker view.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Gary, for the introduction. What I'm going to talk about today is something that concerns all of us. And in recent weeks, after the Willows Project decision by the Biden administration, I've been asked by several people on how do I make of it? Is it a policy reversal, or this something that most of us or many of us who are concerned about climate issues should take it in stride? So why do policymakers neglect climate policies? Or a more positive spin could be, why do policymakers not adequately support climate policies? So it depends how you want to frame it. So there are, in a democratic setup, I would say, well, voters don't care about environmental policy. And if politicians are responding to voter concerns, then obviously politics would go in a particular way. The second explanation is that voters do care, but policymakers don't care. And the reason is that maybe it's the special interests or the huge role of money in politics, especially in America, that's leading to this kind of policy deficit. But this explanation gets a pushback because since 2016, Democrats, that's supposed to be the party which is pro-climate, has been outraising and outspending Republicans in federal elections. So the role of money in politics by itself is not a very compelling explanation about the relative policy neglect of climate issues. The explanation I will offer and defend is that climate transition is disruptive, and it will invite and is inviting opposition from a variety of groups in rural areas, from labor unions, and so on and so forth. And one of the shortcomings of the climate movement of policymakers is we don't have a good plan on to manage these disruptions. So the climate policy lethargy or climate policy inadequacy is because we have not managed the politics of climate change the way we should have been. So what do I mean by that? If one looks at opinion poll data, one would say, well, American public is now increasingly prioritizing climate and environmental issues. In fact, in 2020, more than half of Americans indicated that one of the top priorities of policymakers, that's President of the Congress, should be dealing with global climate change, 52%. This is Pew poll, and Pew is a very reputable non-partisan organization. And if one digs a bit deeper, majority of Americans say that federal government is not doing enough to protect climate and environment. So not only they think climate change ought to be a priority, they also see a kind of a policy failure, at least at the federal level. A school of thought says that one reason individuals are not actively advocating for climate issues is because they don't have any first-hand experience with it. It seems like a problem that will occur somewhere far in the future, and it's not going to affect them. But when Americans are asked that, do you think climate change is going to affect your local community? An overwhelming majority says yes. So on all these counts about feeling that there is inadequacy of policy, federal government should do more, and they themselves and their communities are going to get affected, we should see a very vigorous, a very muscular climate policy in the United States of America at the federal level. And this is reflected also in terms of social mobilization. Greta Thunberg, when she launched the strikes, the climate strikes, it mobilized a very large number of young people across the world, and they have become a very important interest groups. In fact, opinion polls say that there is a generational divide on climate issues. The young people are very pro-climate, overwhelmingly so, in both amongst Republicans and Democrats. So majority of the young Republicans actually want climate action, unlike the older American, that's 35 years and above. So it's interesting that the Thunberg effect, the Greta Thunberg effect, has galvanized the younger generation in favor of climate issues. And we also have substantial experience on both coasts. The Florida hurricanes, the wildfires, now the floods, and the extreme weather events. So anybody who says that climate change is not going to affect me, or I don't know what climate change would look like, or extreme weather events, this is hocus pocus, and this is just a figment of imagination, I don't think it is a very defensible position, because climate change is now everywhere. And we see it in different manifestations in its different ways, with very concrete impact on our health, on our well-being. So it is not surprising that a lot of firms, whether it's high-tech like Microsoft, whether it's consumer products like Unilever, or whether it's the financial sector, as in Larry Fink. Larry Fink is the head of BlackRock, which is the largest financial company in the world. They control over $1 trillion in assets. So across different business sectors, there's an overwhelming support for climate action. And this is very crucial because historically, businesses have opposed regulation. The US Chambers of Commerce, et cetera, have taken a very strong position against environmental regulation, suggesting that environmental regulations would lead to uncompetitiveness. But now we actually find business sector leading, at least in words, if not in deeds, in climate action. To the same extent, now there is a divide between big business Republicans and the business sector, because big business Republicans, the pro-business Republicans now feel that the business sector has become very pro-climate and is therefore not worthy of their support. So all this enthusiasm, political mobilization, business support, has it translated into voters prioritizing climate issues? And the sad answer is no. So 2016 exit polls, Clinton versus Donald Trump, it was very clear that the main policy priorities that motivated voters was foreign policy, immigration, economy, and terrorism, with the economy securing 52% of votes. So one might say, well, 2016 was an anomaly. But 2018, we have the same story getting repeated. It's healthcare, economy, gun, and immigration. 2020, share of voters who prioritized climate change was just 4%. Others were talking about the coronavirus, economy and jobs, healthcare, etc., etc. And even in 2022 exit polls, it's really inflation, abortion, crime, etc., which are taking the high policy salience in terms of the issues voters are prioritizing. So the bottom line is, when it comes to voting, we are not, as voters, walking the climate talk. And one reason could be that when in opinion polls like Pew polls or Gallup polls, people are asked, or the respondents are asked, do you want more climate action? Everybody says, yes, of course. Or the majority says, yes, of course. But when climate issues are put in the same basket with economy, with immigration, with schooling, with crime, and in this election with abortion, climate issues lose salience. So people are making trade-offs. The voters are making trade-offs, and they're prioritizing other issues higher than climate issues. And this kind of response from voters is arguably affecting what politicians do, how much political capital politicians are willing to invest to push for a climate agenda. And this kind of policy failure is also visible at the global level. It's not a US story, it's a global story. The COP, the Conference of Party, the 27th Conference of Parties, which is the annual meeting to review the process on climate change, which was held in Egypt, it was in some ways a failure. It really didn't accomplish much. One reason was that Ukraine invasion and the rise in energy prices kind of overwhelmed all the policy issues. But the fact is, climate issues, especially climate mitigation, got a lip service, and it was very disappointing to many. So why did this happen? So Nevis Dolchak and I have argued that there are 5 ways to think on why we get climate policy from business, from governments, the way we want. So one policy model is what we call climate change is a scientific problem. This is a science-based model. And the assumption is that people, actors don't pursue the climate agenda because they don't have information. So the solution is, if we educate people, if we make people policy literate, it will change their policy beliefs and would lead to policy action. This has obviously not happened because we have a very robust body of scientific evidence. IPCC has done a fantastic job on collecting and presenting this evidence. So I find it difficult to believe that people don't act in particular ways on climate issues because they lack information. In fact, I would suggest there is too much of information and people are unable to process it. The second school of thought says, well, climate change is a moral problem. It's an issue of intergenerational conflict. The current generations are using up the resources for the future, and prominent leaders, Pope Francis, Dalai Lama, etc., have portrayed this as a moral issue. And I'm sure there's an important morality angle in this, but morality by itself is not going to spur climate action. And that is because people in their everyday lives are struggling to pay bills. They're having so many other issues that they simply don't want to invest or have this kind of long shadow of the future. So morality as a leverage to spur climate action is clearly not working. The third perspective, the third model is the economic model. And economists argue that we have greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions because of something called an externality problem. Externality means that I do something, but I don't bear the cost for this. So I burn coal, but I don't pay the cost for emitting carbon dioxide. So as long as we don't tax externalities, we don't price externalities, this bad behavior will continue. So the economic solution is that you start pricing greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pricing, either through carbon taxes or through cap and trade. And at least in the United States of America, carbon taxes are a political no-go. In the state of Washington, our own state, we've had two attempts, 2016 and 2018, to introduce carbon tax through a referendum, and both times it failed by a huge margin, 43 to 57%. So clearly the economic solution that you get the prices right through policy interventions is not working. The fourth model is the Elon Musk, Bill Gates kind of an issue. That climate change is amenable to technological fix. It's a technological problem. If we can get enough electrified vehicles, if we can create modular nuclear reactors, some would even say carbon capture and solar radiation management, etc., we can fix climate change. Now, it is true that new technology will help making climate progress. Electrification of the car industry will go a big way because about 25% of global emissions come from the transportation sector. So I've got nothing against electrification of the industry. Similarly, massive investment in modular nuclear, in solar and wind to bring the prices down would certainly help. But technology by itself will not work unless and until we have political support. And all these technological changes are getting some kind of a pushback, which leads us to the fifth model. That climate change is essentially a political problem. We know science, what has to say. We know what economics has to say. We have a reasonable idea about technological progress. But the issue is implementation. And the reason is that climate policies are going to disrupt the economy, are going to disrupt the society. And people who are getting disrupted, whose livelihood is getting lost, have an incentive to organize and oppose. So let me take the case of coal miners. So coal mining has become kind of a taboo word in the climate circle, and coal is supposed to be, the ultimate enemy. But the reality is that most coal mines are located in very poor areas across the world, not only in the United States. So when a coal mine shuts down, it essentially destroys the community. And you can't expect coal miners to suddenly become solar panel installers or become, software engineers, so on and so forth. People are situated in particular locations. You can't move. You have so many obligations. You have social capital. You have social networks. And in the mind of many coal miners, a war on coal has become a war on coal communities. And the same story is getting repeated in fossil fuel to some extent. Hence the backlash from blue-collar workers, from Teamsters, from truck drivers, that they feel climate change is going to rob them of their livelihood, and we don't have a good plan to support them. When chief executives of failed companies resign, they get a golden parachute. It's ironical that failure is celebrated through a golden parachute. But none of these miners, none of these fossil fuel workers, people who work on offshore drilling sites, have this kind of a parachute. So this is an important cause of anger, not only in the United States, in Europe, in South Africa. In fact, we are just doing a paper on South Africa and trying to assess the climate communities and elsewhere in the world. The second source of opposition is all these solar and wind projects that we are hoping to establish, these will be in rural areas. 23%, that is every fourth US county, now has enacted ordinances restricting these renewable energy projects, including in the state of Washington. Because rural areas, they feel that these wind farms and solar farms are destroying the rural landscape. They're kind of undermining the ruralness of their area. And anyway, why should they generate electricity to sell to urban areas? So it's Eastern Washington versus Western Washington politics, but kind of scaled up to the national level. The same protests are happening in Germany, in UK, in Denmark, in South Korea. So it's not that it's a very US specific problem, it's happening everywhere. Or take the case of solar rooftops. So there's a great enthusiasm that we should install solar panels on rooftops and government should subsidize. On paper, it looks good. But the problem is only rich people have households, and rooftop solar is limited to only rich people. So do we really want the government to be subsidizing rich people? And this war, this political opposition is playing out in California, which has one of the largest solar installations in the country, rooftop solar installations, where environmental groups and social justice groups are saying that the subsidization of solar rooftop is wrong, and this has to be fixed. So there is opposition to renewable energy as generated in solar rooftop. So the bottom line is that we have all these political conflicts that are impeding climate progress. And we need a theory of change. We need proper policy interventions to at least procedurally and substantively address this opposition instead of dismissing them as climate deniers or X, Y, or Z. So broader, this climate conflict is representing what Nevis and I call the sushi and the steak divide. America is now increasingly divided into two parts. The sushi world, that's all of us, highly educated, living in metropolitan cities, enjoying a global lifestyle, and the steak world. And this kind of political divide gets very well captured in elections. If you see who is voting for Democrats, if you just see the map, it's essentially urban areas. These are the largest counties. These are the most affluent counties. In fact, now Republicans have become the party of working class. If you see the data, most Republicans, most working class individuals, families are now voting for Republicans. It's happening in whites, Hispanics in 2022. The Hispanic working class supported Republicans more than it supported Democrats. And increasingly amongst African Americans and Blacks, we have the same trend that people without a college degree who are in the working class are trending towards Republican Party, which is not a party of climate support. So the bottom line is that climate change is getting associated with urban, affluent, middle class, highly educated people. And it feels, rightly or wrongly, that climate books are being balanced on the back of people who are dispossessed, who don't have power. So the broader cultural war in which America is engulfed, which America is fighting, which is spreading in different areas, climate change is getting kind of enmeshed in this cultural war. The issue of economic disruption. I don't know if you watched that lovely movie called No Man's Land. If you didn't, you should watch it. And it essentially captures the state of affairs of people whose livelihood has been disrupted because of economic closure, because of factories closing down. And this is a very important issue, sometimes called the China shock. In 1990s, it was called the NAFTA shock, that when factories close down and people get unemployed, it creates all kinds of social, economic, and political problems. And unless until we have a strong policy for what is called just climate transition, so that coal miners, coal communities, fossil fuel workers, and their families and communities can find a reasonable, respectable alternative source of livelihood, as climate people, we are just solidifying the opposition to our policies, which is not a good idea at all. And we now have opposition from Native American groups and climate groups to renewable energy projects. So Greta Thunberg joined indigenous groups in Norway, the Samis, to oppose wind energy projects. In Nevada, the Thacker Pass mine, which is going to be the largest lithium mine, and lithium is a key component for electric car batteries, is being opposed by Native American groups because they think this mine is going to destroy a lot of cultural artifacts and a lot of the land which is sacred to them. So these stories are getting repeated in lots of places where local people, rural people, Native Americans, environmental groups are opposing climate projects because they think it's unfair, because they think a lot of these projects are going to destroy the environment, are going to destroy cultural symbols, religious sites, which they find to be unacceptable. So is there any good news? I've just been parroting bad news, and I would say, yes, there is good news. We did pass in the United States of America, the Inflation Reduction Act. It is the largest ever federal spending of more than $400 billion. It depends how you count, but money makes a difference. Because when federal government puts in that kind of money, the interest group mobilization starts. And a lot of this money is actually being funneled in red states. So a lot of states in the South are now competing with one another to establish a new electric vehicle factory, a new battery factory, a new supply chain for this component or that component. So it has unleashed a new kind of political dynamics. So this IRA is going to have a very long-term effect in shifting the politics of the United States by creating new interest groups that have an interest in climate policy. Nevis and I, and with a graduate student, Megan, we actually did a paper recently published where we showed statistically that the Green New Deal actually affected positively the political fortunes of people who had endorsed it. So about more than 100 members of the House endorsed the Green New Deal, which was a resolution, not a bill, in the House of Representatives. And we looked at their vote share against the vote share of people who did not endorse it. And we found a 2% increase. And 2% increase in vote share in American politics is a very, very big deal. So there is probably, at the margin, some political payoffs for being pro-climate and an outspoken climate advocate. Donald Trump, surprisingly, signed an executive order that prohibited drilling along a large portions of the Atlantic coast. Florida, Virginia, North Carolina, all these were swing states. Many of them depend on tourism, and tourists don't like to see oil rigs. So he signed an executive order, which was quite surprising because Trump is very pro-fossil fuels, pro-drilling, and doesn't have much respect for the climate agenda, and yet he signed it. Also, during his presidency, United States earmarked a very substantial sum for national parks, for upkeep of national parks, which had huge deferred maintenance. And this main was championed by Republicans, of course, with support of Democrats. Steve Daines of Montana, who was facing a very tough re-election battle in Montana, championed it because Montana has a very sizable tourism industry and tourists are attracted by national parks. So the bottom line is that environmental issues actually are helpful in competitive races, and Republicans recognize that being pro-environment in particular ways can help them in their electoral fortunes. If a recent paper showed that 1/3 of climate policies at the state level are being enacted in the Republican states. Texas leads the country in both wind and solar. So to say Republicans are anti-climate is actually not true. Republicans at the federal level have different politics than at the state level. And at the state level, Republicans are okay with climate issues as long as you don't call them climate. So they rather call them economic development. They rather call them national security. The governor of Indiana, Governor Halcombe, who's a Republican, is one of the most outspoken supporters of the Mammoth Solar Project in Indiana, which is going to be the largest solar project in the country. And this is over and above the other kinds of incentives he's doled out. And there is intense local opposition. The local county wanted to enact an ordinance prohibiting the solar farm, but Halcombe and others are lobbying that this must go through because it's important for economic development. In fact, a lot of states are now enacting what we call ban on bans. Local counties are banning or restricting solar and wind projects, but what politicians are doing, they're going at the state level to prohibit counties from enacting some ordinances. Illinois has done it, New York has done it, Ohio and Indiana are trying. So it's very interesting to see at the local level, there is a pro-renewable energy sentiment, although not couched in climate terms. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is that politicians pay attention to environmental issues in competitive elections. So the message to all of you is, after you have graduated from University of Washington, if you decided to stay in a blue state, you wasted your vote. Migrate to a red state or migrate to a purple state, because that is where your vote will count if you want to make your vote count. We are a one-party state and everybody's pro-environment. It all depends how much pro-environment you are. So keep that in mind. Environmental issues have electoral payoff in competitive elections. Second, climate issues gain traction when they focus on local benefits, not save the earth rhetoric. This moral appeal, the earth is burning, this is actually not helping. In some ways, it's causing climate anxiety amongst younger generation. People are becoming very anxious. People feel helpless. We are kind of depriving a big generation, a huge generation of agency. I think what needs to be done, and this is what the results are showing, and the evidence is showing, that talk climate change in terms of economic development, in terms of local benefits, in terms of jobs, because this is what people listen to. This is what people respond to. One of the problems with the climate movement is it gets too hung up on language. And it becomes very important for them to keep on saying climate, climate, climate. But climate has become a trigger word for many Republicans. So if we want bipartisanship, we want everybody to work together, we want renewable energy projects to go forward, let's drop the word climate from the political rhetoric. Let's call it energy transition. Let's call it economic development. So these changes can help further climate agenda. And as Deng Xiaoping had said, that doesn't matter what the color of the cat is, it should catch the mice. So all of us want a very strong, muscular climate policy, a quick climate transition. And one way to achieve this is to change our language, to change our rhetoric. And finally, climate transition will hurt many communities. The mining that would be required to supply what are called critical minerals will be huge. And a lot of these communities are located in Native American tribes or located in poorer areas. And mining is a very dirty activity. So we must have a game plan to understand why people are opposing climate action, or why are people opposing new mines? Why are people opposing wind projects? We've been doing a bit of research on this, and the lesson is very clear, at least for us. People are not questioning climate science. People are questioning who's going to pick up the costs and benefits. So we have to rethink our politics, that how can we make sure that rural areas actually welcome wind energy projects, they welcome solar energy projects, and their concerns are legitimately addressed respectfully. So procedural justice is very important, instead of this cultural condescension that often takes place. And to what extent can we address them? Same with coal communities, same with oil communities. Okay, I will stop now and I'll take the questions.
Thank you, Steve. As always, I especially appreciated in your presentation the attention you were giving to the international context, because climate change is a global problem, and thinking about the differences across countries is really useful. I have a question related to that I'm going to hold off completely. I'm hoping we've run out of time because there are so many student questions. Those of you on Zoom, you can send questions to the chat, and we will have Sean raise his hand if a particularly good one pops in there. Okay, who's going to be first? Yes.
I actually did have a question on international context.
Okay, go ahead.
So, for like countries that are, less developed than the United States, like whose economies that are mostly dependent on oil, like Nigeria. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts as to how the United States should help them, if they should even assist countries internationally with that at all, in transitioning different renewable energy?
Right. Thank you. Should I respond, Gary?
Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
So if I understood correctly, you're saying there are a lot of developing countries or countries in the global south which depend on fossil fuel. And if climate transition happens, they will suffer huge economic damage. How should the United States help them? Did I interpret it correctly?
Yes.
Did I interpret your question correctly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is what we call the just transition debate. And as I briefly mentioned, Nevis I, with two scholars from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, we've just finished a paper where we interviewed mining communities in South Africa. South Africa is the biggest user of coal and the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in Africa. and coal is the lifeline of that country, and at least the sub-Saharan African electricity market. Coal is also very cheap because it's locally available. So when we talk about climate change and phasing out of coal, there is obviously a lot of nervousness. And this is where the whole issue of just transition has become important. So developed countries have promised $100 billion in something called the Just Transition Fund, but they have actually not funded the promised fund. And it's not very clear how this fund is going to be distributed. And this has become pretty intense, much to our surprise. When we did interviews in South Africa and we asked former miners that how would you like this money to be dispersed, they said, just keep the government out of it because the government is corrupt. If you give them any money, it will go in the pockets of the politicians. So in the United States, we think if we have a social security program, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, and the government, provides money, it will reach people. In many developing countries, this assumption is not true. So the bottom line is that money alone, economic transfers alone, are not going to adequately address the economic backlash from coal mining communities in South Africa, from India, or from China. A much more, I would say, innovative approach is needed. And I firmly believe the role of private sector and the nonprofit sector, the NGO sector, will be very critical here. Because if firms take up the responsibility as they have done in the United States of greening their supply chain, of making it more climate friendly, and they help in economic transition, I think there'll be more trust. Same with the nonprofit sector. If somehow we can develop a mechanism to make sure that the intended money that Western donors are providing actually reaches the population instead of taken over by corrupt bureaucrats, climate transition would be easier. That's one. Number two, South Africa may ditch coal, but it still needs electricity, right? So along with phasing out coal, there has to be a massive program of creating renewable energy capacity. Otherwise, what will happen is you phase out coal, but you don't have replacement. The country gets into blackouts and it creates a backlash against the government and eventually against climate policy. So hopefully people who are looking into these issues are trying to, connect all the dots and making sure that phasing out coal co-occurs with installing new capacity. I am a bit discouraged because I see different people handling these issues and there is not adequate coordination, but I'm sure, there are very smart people in the world who will be able to figure this out. But at the moment, as in the United States, my concern is about policy implementation. It's not about intentions. It's not about willingness to pay. It's about policy implementation. And that's where we are lagging a bit.
Good question. Next.
I have one.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so talking about like different communities and the needs for the climate, like the climate transition. How can like larger governments like reconcile the needs or the inequalities between local communities?
Give me an example. That's a good question. Can you construct a hypothetical example?
Like someone wants to build a solar plant in the middle of California, but then you're going to remove a coal mine from like North Carolina. Like those are both adding to the climate transition, but they impact communities. Like they have a significant impact on the communities in kind of both negatively, but then they have a greater overall positive impact.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question because you're highlighting that both closing a coal mine and creating a solar farm, both can have negative local impacts. So far, we've been only talking about coal mines. Wind farms and solar farms are not within the purview for conversation. I don't see many environmental groups fretting about the local impact of solar farms or wind farms or wind turbines. And this is the conversation we need to have, because it's a very, just give me a second. This is an important conversation we need to have, because the scale of renewable energy projects is massive. What do I mean by that? If you look at how much land is required to generate 1 megawatt of electricity, the most efficient is nuclear. Nuclear plants are extremely efficient because they are not land intensive. And then you'll get coal and gas, and then you'll get hydro. The problem with hydro is it causes a lot of ecological damage. So in most parts of the world, hydro is now not in good books of environmental groups, and for right reasons. Solar farms require a lot of land. They're very, very land intensive. And sorry. They're very, very land intensive. And the problem is that most parts of the world are land scarce. United States of America is one of the exceptions. We are a relatively I'll not say land surplus country, but compared to other parts of the world, the population densities are not that high. So of course, there are other measures like offshore wind and so on and so forth, but that raises different kind of problems. I'm sure all of you are following the developments in New Jersey, where there is a huge backlash against offshore wind farms by coastal towns that are suggesting that it's killing whales. A lot of whales are getting washed on the beaches and shores of New Jersey. So I hope your generation, the new cadre of managers, governmental, public managers, private managers, non-profit leaders will take these issues of climate justice more seriously, and climate justice in its multiple dimensions. And the questions you need to ask is the distribution of benefits and costs equitable? If not, then we have a potential justice problem. And until we are sensitive to that problem, we are respectful in hearing different views, what we call procedural justice. We are giving an opportunity for different interest groups to air their perspectives. We are going to create a backlash that we are witnessing in many parts of the country as well, including the state of Washington.
Within that example, how do we begin to even measure if equity is being distributed as it should? I mean, like when we look at that example, like how do we quantify the benefit of reducing fossil fuels versus the impact it'll have in local communities?
So there is actually a lot of work on that already. The work started in 1980s when it became mandatory for any federal regulation to have a cost-benefit analysis. And then starting 2000s, when China joined the WTO, a lot of heavy industries in different parts of the world shut down. It's called the China shock. And people have estimated the local impact, first on economy, and the second order effect on health, on mortality, on this and that. So I think we have a lot of data already. We have a lot of techniques to understand local impact of what we call economic disruption. So I don't think the problem is data. The problem is first having an imagination. Until 2015, climate groups were not even recognizing the just transition problem. That coal communities and coal labor unions and blue-collar labor unions have to be engaged in the policy process. It's the forming of what is called the Blue-Green Alliance that these kinds of political dynamics have been unleashed. And now some labor groups are working with environmental groups to find a path forward that can address the needs of both labor unions and their constituencies and climate. So I think the IRA has allocated some modest amounts for redeveloping the Appalachia region and so on and so forth, but much more needs to be done. This should not be an afterthought. It should not be a footnote. It should be at the front and center. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about coal, we should also in the same breath talk about protecting coal communities. Mayor Michael Bloomberg funded the anti-coal campaign along with uh, Sierra Club. I think he put in about $110 million an anti-coal campaign. So Nevis and I actually wrote to Michael Bloomberg. He never responded. That Mayor Bloomberg, would you be willing to donate another $100 million to protect coal communities? Every time you go and you say, let's shut this coal mine down, imagine if the environmental groups say, we are shutting the coal mines down, but can we create alternative employment opportunities so the coal miners and coal communities are protected? So if you are willing to impose a cost, can we also create a measure to ameliorate those costs? This rhetoric is missing from climate groups. So now coal is evil. If you're doing coal work, you are evil, and everything that comes with that. So the political rhetoric has become extremely toxic. And we need to kind of step back and say, these are people. A coal miner is a miner. They're working because they want to put food on the table, feed their families. And let's deal with the issue with some empathy and put ourselves in their situation. We are not doing that. So there is a lot of cultural condescension. There is a lot of, the urban-rural cultural clash you can see in its full glory when you, kind of observe these conversations. So I think we need a change in attitude because climate transition is going to take several decades, not years, several decades. And we don't want the economy, the society to be torn apart because it is for everybody's better in the future. Coal has played a very important role in creating the wealth of this country, and we should be grateful to coal miners. But now time of coal is over. We need to move to new fuels. And that is why it's important to recognize the contribution of coal, but also the need to move forward because, we want to save the planet. Climate change is very real, and it is a very serious problem. So that, what I call intellectual humility, that is absent from our conversations. And a lot of people find this extremely irritating. So part of the reaction is also the kind of language, the kind of, impression climate groups and urban groups convey when they talk with blue-collar communities, rural areas. There's a cultural clash. So we probably, at UW, we need to create courses in, cultural sensitivity, that how should we, talk about policy issues in audience that might be bearing costs of these policy changes. And how do we create consensus? I think our social skills need to be upgraded. And I'm not the first person saying this. It's being said a lot of time. One of the biggest problems we now face is social media. Because what social media is creating is echo chambers. We are losing the inability to debate, to disagree, and to hear different perspectives. And if climate groups are populated by young people and young people are active on social media, one can start seeing the connection that there is a diminished dialogue. So if I have one advice to give, unsolicited advice to give one of you is that engage with dialogue with people you disagree with. Because we can, with dialogue, always find a position which is not the best for either party, but still is a step forward. This is how, in a democratic polity, policies get made. Otherwise, we have policy chaos, we have a lot of friction, and we have a lot of, acerbic interactions, which is not good for the state of the health, state of the economy, or the climate.
We are near the end of our time. I don't know if you have time for maybe one more question. If anybody needs to leave to get a bus or anything, feel free to do that, okay? But will you take one more question if we have one?
Please, go ahead.
Now I'm going to ask a real short yes or no one first, which is, did Michael Bloomberg write you a check?
He didn't even acknowledge our email.
Ah, okay. Okay. Do we have one more question? Somebody would love to be able to ask.
I have a question here online. How might framing climate solutions differently to Republicans be a temporary fix that later creates problems in the future?
Good question.
That framing now be problematic. You see that on the horizon.
Gary, could you reread the question? Because of the echo, I couldn't understand.
Right. I think the question is the reframing of issues that you've recommended for Republican audiences likely to come back and bite us later? in some way, to have political repercussions down the road that would be counterproductive for environmentalism generally?
In my opinion, no. Just calling a solar farm as economic development, I don't see any downside in it. And I don't see how it could hurt all of us in the long run. So the short answer is no.
Excellent answer. So, thanks, Asim, for your
Thank you.
time.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks. Bye-bye.